Thank you very much. Bonjour à tous.
Hello, everyone. I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 52 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage. I would like to acknowledge that this meeting is taking place on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people.
Reference adopted by the House on Tuesday, the 31st, 2022. The committee is meeting on the study of Bill C-18, an act respecting online communications platforms that make news content available to persons in Canada. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House of Commons orders of June the 23rd, 2022, and members are attending in person in the room and others are remotely using the Zoom application. I want to make a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon at the bottom of your screen to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. For those on the floor or for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English or French. That is a little round globe icon that is your interpretation icon. And for those in the room, obviously, you can use the earpiece and select your desired English or French channel. A reminder that all comments should be made through the chair. And I will ask the clerk to clarify and confirm that all witnesses have been completed the required confirmation connection test and that they are using the House of Commons device. We have had an accident with non-House of Commons device by witnesses, and we don't want to repeat that. So can you confirm that for me, clerk?
Yes, Madam Chair. All of the witnesses have done their equipment testing and they're using House of Commons headsets.
Thank you very much. Now I want to welcome the witnesses. So just for the benefit of the witnesses, I want you to know that you have 5 minutes to present. If there is more than one of you representing your organization, one of you will speak and you can make that decision. We don't make it for you. I will give you a 30-second literal shout out when you have 30 seconds left so you can wrap up. And then, of course, we're going to go into, after that, we're going to go into a question and answer session. So I will begin, again, welcome to the witnesses, and I will begin with Dadan Sivun. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it, so can you please correct me when you come on? Jean Larose, President and Chief Executive Officer by video conference. So we're going to begin with Monsieur Larose, but the other people present are the National Ethnic Press and Media Council of Canada, Maria Saras Voutsinas, Executive Director, Unifor Randy Kitt, Media Sector Director, and Dr. Michael Geist, Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-Commerce Law, Faculty of Law, University of Ottawa, and Dr. Taylor Owen, Beaverbrook Chair in Media, Ethics and Communications, an Associate Professor and Director of the Center for Media Technology and Democracy, McGill University. So I will begin with Michel Larose for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just before I start my presentation and my time, it's pronounced Dadan Sivunawut. Dadan means our peoples in Southern Shoshone, and Sivunawut means our future in Inuktitut.
Thank you so very much. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Madam
for
Chair.
5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Madam Chairperson and committee members. Thank you for the invitation to discuss Bill C-18. I am Jean Larose, President and Chief Executive Officer of Dadan Sivunawut. I am Abenaki from the Odanak First Nation and thank the Algonquin Nation for allowing us to meet on their unceded territory. Dadan Sivunawut was created by APTN in 2019 to assume responsibility for APTN's non-television activities. Among other businesses, Dadan Sivunawut oversees First Peoples Radio, which operates radio stations in Ottawa and Toronto, and is active in Indigenews, a digital news service based in Western Canada and covering the ancestral and unceded homelands of the Hunkaminam and Squamish-speaking peoples. The Dan Sivunavut supports the objective of Bill C-18, which will provide ongoing support for news organizations to offset the impact of dominant digital intermediaries on Canadian journalism. But the bill needs to better reflect the unique place of Indigenous news organizations based on Canada's commitment to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. UNDRIP includes the express recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples to operate our own media in our own languages. At the least, Bill C-18 should place Indigenous news outlets on the same footing as non-Indigenous local news services. Intentionally or not, the bill creates a kind of hierarchy of news services, and diverse news outlets, including those service Indigenous communities, are placed on a lower tier than other local news services. Let me explain. As it stands now, Section 11.1 of the bill requires that agreements with digital intermediaries must include a significant portion of local news businesses and contribute to the sustainability of those businesses. In comparison, for Indigenous news outlets, those agreements need to include only a range of news outlets reflecting diversity, including language, race, and Indigenous communities. This is a much lower standard. The bill does not require that a significant portion of Indigenous news outlets be included or that the agreements contribute to sustainability. It should. We have proposed specific language to improve the bill that would address this issue. I will quickly take you through it. Our proposed language would include a reference to UNDRIP in the recitals to the bill and a reference to Indigenous storytelling as a component of Indigenous news. We propose a specific definition for an Indigenous news outlet, which is one that is controlled by Indigenous peoples and produces news content for Indigenous peoples. We propose in Section 11.1 of the bill that agreements reached by digital news intermediaries include a significant portion of Indigenous news outlets and meaningfully support their sustainability. We propose that the eligibility criteria for news outlets in Section 27 and 31 of the bill also reflect the unique characteristics of Indigenous news outlets and the core issues affecting Indigenous rights and self-government, in the same way that Canada's democratic institutions and practices are core matters for non-Indigenous news services. Lastly, we propose that the list of arbitrators to be maintained under Section 31 of the bill include Indigenous persons. These changes will help to make Bill C-18 meaningful for Indigenous peoples and for our right to operate our own media in our own languages. This is a critical time in Canada for Indigenous peoples and for Canadians as we travel together on the road to reconciliation. We will face challenges, but we are hopeful that we will also earn the rewards of greater understanding, a revitalization of Indigenous cultures and languages. We support Bill C-18 with the changes we have proposed as one step on this road, but it is only a step. We have also encouraged the government to provide direct support for Indigenous media through independently administered, stable, and meaningful funding. While I recognize that a fund is not what we are discussing today, I strongly believe that a fund administered by an independent body and focused on supporting a new generation of Indigenous journalists in Indigenous media, as well as other diversity media, is a necessity. We should not lose sight of the high barriers Indigenous peoples face in conserving and promoting our cultures and languages. No one bill will be sufficient, though if it truly reflects Indigenous rights and cultures, this one will help at a critical time. I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I go to the National Ethnic Press, Maria Saras-Voutsinas. For 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon. My name is Maria Saras-Voutsinas, and I'm here today representing the National Ethnic Press and Media Council of Canada. Our organization's membership runs the full gamut of press and media, television, radio, hard copy, online. Our members are communications entities with professionally trained journalists who publish primarily in a language that is neither English nor French. We publish dailies, weeklies, monthlies, and so forth in non-official languages. Our reach, given Canada's birth rate and immigration policies, is currently 23% of the potential user market. That demographic is the only growing one, according to Statistics Canada. You have heard from tech experts, digital giants, and mainstream media on the impact of the transition to digital consumption of communications and entertainment content. It continues to be a valuable exercise. None of it is new. Governments are trying to balance the playing field. We applaud this initiative, and we do not want you to leave our members behind. We are just as impacted as the mainstream media. We have always competed for advertising dollars to survive. Advertisers, including governments, turn to digital platforms. For context, the government spent more on Facebook, Instagram advertising last year than all print publications combined, both mainstream and ethnic. To appreciate the impact, consider the testimony of one of the Meta executives before this committee. His company draws over $200 million per annum from Canada, yet it produces no content. We feel that C18 is asking those digital giants to recognize the virtual partnerships they have with content creators like our members, whose growth results in the increase of the reach of those platforms. We would feel more confident if we knew the rules going in and not after the doors are closed on C18. That includes the conditions everyone must meet to be at the table. Our members can and will meet them. We are also asking you to put in an amendment to C18 to allow owner-operator journalists to count toward the journalism minimum, so more ethnic and rural publishers can negotiate collectively. The pandemic was and is an incredibly turbulent time for ethnic news publishers. Readership surged, but advertising cratered. A number of publishers had a very tough decision to make between continuing to report the news to minority language groups who needed vital pandemic information or cutting their losses and shutting down. I'm very proud that the vast majority of our outlets decided that providing vital health information to their communities was paramount. They published even though it was at a loss. Being able to bring news to your community, which sometimes may not have a strong grasp of English or French, brought our publishers a lot of pride. It helped new and established immigrant Canadians find a place for themselves and feel more connected to their community. We think it is crucial for democracy that Canadians have access to news, including those who consume their news in non-official languages. There is an imbalance that needs to be addressed between large digital platforms and the local news outlets that produce the content that provides platforms with value. We strongly believe that the framework of C18 can and will include support for ethnic publishers who need the help now more than ever. While we are encouraged to see the digital giants have signed deals with select outlets in Canada, we are very troubled that none of those outlets have been with ethnic media. It is clear Meta and Google will not willingly partner with the ethnic press to ensure that compensation is equitable. That is why we're asking for C18 so that our membership may have a fair negotiation to be paid for their content. I've heard from so many members of my own Greek community what a difference having Canadian news in Greek has meant to them. Many of those readers felt invested in our country, sought English and French classes, and later became Canadian citizens. That is what the news can do. It can take people out of isolation and better explain their neighbors, their province, and their country. And that is good for democracy. We have been working closely with our colleagues at News Media Canada, and we agree on an approach that is fair and equitable and benefits both small and large publishers. We are one industry and proud to stand together to ensure that Canadians have access to reliable news in the language that they are most comfortable with. Thank you all for your time, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. I now go to the Unifor, Randy Kitt, for 5 minutes. Mr. Kitt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Unifor is Canada's largest private sector union with more than 310,000 members. Our union represents more than 10,000 media workers, including journalists in the broadcast and print news industry. Journalism is a public good, and its role in holding power to account, strengthening democracy, and building community has never been more important. Social media has proven to divide us, pitting neighbor against neighbor. We are more polarized than ever, but a strong Canadian news media can build community. I don't think I need to spend too much time on the problem because I think we can all agree the news industry, and especially local news, is in crisis. The Public Policy Forum has done some great work documenting this decline in their updated Shattered Mirror report. Advertising revenue for community newspapers has dropped 66% from 2011 to 2020. During that time, almost 300 papers either disappeared or merged with other publications. The list of dead newspapers reads like a roll call of regional and small-town Canada. In broadcasting, it's a similar story. News outlets are closing, consolidating, and downsizing. Unifor's own membership numbers confirm this trend. Between 2009 and 22, the Toronto Star's membership declined from 610 to 178 members, a decrease of 70%. In broadcasting between 2017 and 21, employment decreased by 16%. This all results in less journalism and less news with nothing to replace it. Where has all the advertising gone? American web giants Google and Facebook have cornered the world's advertising market. Their market share dominance is an abuse of power where they dictate terms and price. It's important to note that they don't produce any news of their own, local or otherwise. How to solve the problem? Well, to some, including myself, the answer seems simple. Google and Facebook must pay their fair share and contribute to the creation of Canadian news. But how? Unifor first submitted the best approach was a news fund, but Australia went in another direction and had success in creating legislation that compelled the platforms to negotiate with news outlets for fair compensation for their product. Thus, C18, the Canadian Online News Act, was born. Unifor supports the speedy passage of this bill as we are almost too late to act. Without this support, more news outlets will close as they are already on the brink. Unifor had three main concerns with the drafting of Bill C18. 1, inclusivity. No eligible news outlets should be left behind. 2, accountability. The money received by these deals needs to be earmarked for news creation. And 3, transparency. The value of these deals needs to be public knowledge. Although not perfect, and we have submitted some minor amendments to tweak the bill, Unifor believes that C18 strikes a good balance on these issues. On the first, the bill acknowledges that diversity must play a key role in inclusivity. Smaller outlets must be included, and the bill is also platform agnostic to recognize broadcasters and podcasters. Unifor submits that all eligible news outlets should be included. On the second, Unifor maintains that this money goes towards news creation. Hiring journalists to tell our stories and to hold power to account is the most important metric to measuring the success of this initiative. And thirdly, transparency. The platforms have ensured that the value of deals negotiated thus far are shrouded in non-disclosure agreements. Unifor submits that the value of deals negotiated should be made public. We do know, however, that this bill will allow the CRTC to give us annual aggregated numbers as we currently receive in the broadcasting industry. Unifor would also suggest that arbitrators should have special access to the value of these deals and other relevant information, confidential information, so they can make informed decisions in the arbitration process. Now, if we only had a quasi-judicial body that's arm's length from the government to handle the administration of this bill. To be clear, Unifor has not always agreed with the CRTC's decisions, but Unifor applauds the decision to have the CRTC administer this bill, as we believe they are well suited to this work. To sum up, the news industry is in crisis, and local news is essential to the public good in a functioning democracy. We know from the Australians that a bargaining code with an arbitration process can be successful, and we believe C18 is an improvement on the Australian legislation. Unifor supports speedy passage of this legislation with very minor adjustments. Let's not get sidetracked by noise. Let's get C18 passed
30
to
seconds.
ensure a sustainable future for local news. Now, let's all imagine a world without news. Imagine the void. And now imagine you can do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I will move to Dr. Taylor Owen, Beaverbrook Chair in Media Ethics and Communication. Dr. Owen, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much. And look, thank you for having me here today. A lot has been said about C18 in the media and at this committee over the past months. And I want to start by acknowledging the real and often existential stakes involved for the journalism businesses on all sides of this debate. I'm just an observer to this, but I value the views of all of those who are ultimately materially impacted by the policy decisions that you're making here. Some want no government intervention in the market of journalism at all, which is a view I respect but don't share. For me, journalism, and more broadly, the access to reliable information, is a precondition for democratic society. And in the face of clear market failures, warrants careful public policy intervention. With that said, let me make a few observations about this particular intervention. First, I think we need to acknowledge the reality that platforms already have deals with publishers. These deals, with a select group of publishers chosen by the platforms themselves, are for undisclosed sums of money and hidden behind NDAs. We simply have no idea whether publishers have been pressured or incentivized in their reporting in any way. I understand that some publishers who already have deals would rather stick to the devil they know, but the interest of public policy should be to make these deals more equitable and accountable to the Canadian public. Second, it's very clear that no one policy will fix journalism. The effect that the internet has had on the businesses and practices of journalism is wide-ranging and complex. This policy mechanism addresses one aspect of this challenge, the bargaining imbalance between publishers and platforms. A very asymmetry, I would argue, is demonstrated by the inequity of these current deals. However, analysis of the role of this policy must be done alongside other policies that support Canadian journalism, most importantly, in my view, the Journalism Labour Tax Credit. Third, while many, including myself in the past, have suggested an alternative centralized fund model, I think we need to acknowledge that it too has some fundamental challenges. It would require government to either create a dedicated tax on platforms, a link tax, if you will, or themselves put general revenue into a fund of their creation and design. The former could be in breach of USMCA, and both are far more intrusive government interventions in journalism than the bargaining code. Fourth, while this bill has been widely characterized as the Australian model, it is in fact, in my view, fundamentally different. The addition of specified exemption criteria are the central policy mechanism in this bill. The list of those terms, how platforms demonstrate they have met them, and how they are evaluated and audited are all absolutely critical to this policy working in the public interest. This bill also adds meaningful, I think, public accountability and transparency tools that the Australian bill lacked. Which brings me to my last point. The fact that this bill has improved materially on the Australian model has significantly increased the likelihood that other countries, such as the UK, Germany, South Africa, and maybe even the US, will very soon adopt a similar model. And it is this likelihood, not of Canadian implementation, but of its global spread, that I think has shaped the character of the platform's response to this bill. Google has every right to lobby for their interests, but their strategy in this case has sought to divide news organizations, parliamentarians, and Canadians. I hate that journalist friends from small and large organizations alike are being pitted against one another. And Facebook's threat to turn off access to reliable information is to me revealing about their place in our democratic society. I hope that it's being treated with the seriousness it warrants at the highest levels of the Canadian and US governments. All this said, this bill is not perfect and involves difficult trade-offs. I would suggest the committee ask 4 questions about it. First, how can this bill make the terms of deals as maximally transparent as legally possible? I know there are real limits to what can be shared publicly, but the regulator should report as much as possible and as regularly as possible. Second, how can the bill be maximally inclusive while ensuring the journalistic integrity of recipients? Making the bill more restrictive, as Google has proposed, would exclude smaller publishers. Making the requirements too lenient could lead to the inclusion of non-journalistic sites. Third, how can this bill ensure that platforms are incentivized to promote journalistic content and to penalize harmful content, and not the inverse? Clarity around non-discrimination is a fairly easy fix. Finally, I think it is reasonable to ask whether this bill is suitably flexible and amenable to future and certain changes in both the economics of platforms and of the news industry. No journalism policy, in my view, should be designed to be permanent, but should instead aspire to be no longer necessary. I'm happy to share more detailed amendments in the spirit of these 4 questions, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Owen. And I now move to Dr. Geist, Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-Commerce Law at the University of Ottawa. Dr. Geist, for 5 minutes, please.
Sure. Thank you very much, Chair. Good afternoon. My name is Michael Geist, law professor at the University of Ottawa, appearing in a personal capacity representing only my own views. Thanks to the committee for this unexpected opportunity to speak again about Bill C-18, particularly following some of the technical challenges that I faced during a prior appearance. I'd like to focus my remarks on why I think the bill mandates payment for links and why I think that creates a threat to freedom of expression. But before doing so, let me highlight several additional concerns that I'd be happy to address in further detail during the question period. First, Bill C-18's eligibility criteria are deeply flawed. I think everyone's aware, and you've already heard, that the current rules may exclude some small news outlets. Beyond that, the dominance of broadcasters in the system, notably companies such as Bell as well as the CBC, I believe run counter to the professed goal of the bill supporting local independent news. The Parliamentary Budget Officer estimates that more than 75% of the revenues will go to these companies. This despite limited tangible connection between links and radio stations, and that CBC News content, I think, is a public good for which facilitating access should be encouraged. Second, many of the eligible news outlets will not be subject to journalistic standards under this bill, unlike the QCGO model, which features detailed rules to ensure appropriate standards before tax support is available. Bill C-18 allows other news outlets, including foreign outlets, to qualify without similar standards, risking low-quality journalism. Third, Bill C-18 violates copyright norms by suspending limitations and exceptions from the bargaining process in Section 24. This runs counter to the foundation of Canadian copyright law and may violate Article 10, Sub 1 of the Berne Convention, which has a mandatory right of quotation that expressly includes news articles. Fourth, Bill C-18 establishes final offer arbitration, yet still intervenes in the process by allowing the panel to reject final offers. That upends the entire purpose of the model, which is designed to encourage best offers by both sides. Fifth, I think it's important to note that the government's existing policies with tax support may be working. Minister Rodriguez talked about over 400 news outlets closing since 2008, but neglected to mention that the same report found over 200 new news outlets opening in the same period, and that there have been no net new losses over nearly the last 2 years. There's other concerns, but I want to use my remaining time to focus on what I think is the biggest issue, mandated payments for links. The definition of facilitating access to news content in Section 2, Sub 2, upon which this system is based, includes a breathtakingly broad definition that clearly includes links, aggregation, and even indexing. The inclusion of links is not in doubt. Minister Rodriguez has talked about the value of links. The Canadian Association of Broadcasters, when they appeared before this committee, talked about the value of links, saying that the whole purpose of why we're here and what we're talking about with Bill C-18 had to do with value of links. And even earlier this week, Mr. Coutu said that he found it astonishing that some argue that if you click on a Twitter link, there is no value. The Supreme Court of Canada has warned that creating links could impair the way the internet functions. Yet payment for links are at the core of this bill, and it doesn't matter if it is an aggregate charge for all links or a per-link fee. The harm is the same. Bill C-18 not only requires payment for links, it says that expression with links is not equal. Links to news content from sources such as Bell or the CBC are viewed as compensable, but similar links to news content from small media outlets are not. Further, the bill effectively says that whether compensation is due also depends on the expression, on where the expression occurs, since it mandates that certain venues pay to allow their users to express themselves. Post a link to a Globe and Mail news article on Facebook, and the bill says there is value that should be compensated. Post the same link on Twitter, as Mr. Coutu noted, and the bill says it doesn't. Aside from the obvious unfairness, the broader implications of this policy, I think, are even more troubling. Once the law says that some platforms must pay to permit expression, the same principle can be applied to other policy objectives, and the entire foundation for sharing information online is placed at risk.
30 seconds.
To be clear, helping journalism is important, but Bill C-18's dangerous approach ascribes value to links where there isn't any, regulates which platforms must pay in order to permit expression from their users, and dictates which sources are entitled to compensation. There are better ways to do this, including the fund model that has been supported by some of today's panelists in the past. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Geist. And I now go to the question and answer segment. The first round is a 6-minute round, and I'd like to warn witnesses that the 6 minutes includes the question and the answer. So can everyone be as brief and as to the point as possible? And so I begin this round with the Conservative Party, Kevin Waugh. Kevin, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses, not only today, but through the weeks that we have been discussing C-18. This is the last day that we will have witnesses come to our committee. And I want to thank those that have forwarded amendments, because today is the last day that we can have amendments ready, as in 2 weeks' time we will be going through the amendments here in the Heritage Department. So I just want to clarify and actually state on record, Madam Chair, that I want to be clear here that Conservatives over the last couple of months have had a number of problems with C18. We've expressed them. But I also want to say, Madam Chair, through you, we support the principle of requiring the web giants to pay more to compensate Canadian news media, and particularly the local newspapers that are struggling throughout this country. That is why, on this side, we invited the Saskatchewan Newspapers Association. That's why we also had the Alberta News Association come, where they said 50% of their membership in Alberta would not qualify. I knew because of my province, up to 70 to 80% of my province would not qualify for C18. I am going to quote Mari Wolf, who did a fabulous job yesterday in the Globe and Mail, pointing to one of the years. The Davidson Leader newspaper sold a couple of years ago for $1. $1. She did a story with Dan Senig, who bought it. They have over 60% subscription in the Davidson Leader newspaper. Everybody wants to find out, unfortunately, who died. The obits are the number one in that newspaper. And they also put it on Facebook. Who should be paying for that? So I just wanted to say, through you, Madam Chair, I was very happy with that article, and everybody was quoted yesterday, the Liberals and the NDP and myself. It's true. We're really worried about the state of local journalism in rural Canada, not just Saskatchewan or Alberta, but throughout this country. So let's start. I think I'm going to start with the National Ethic Press and Media. It's the first time we've had you in front of us, Maria, and it's a developing one. We know the Liberals want to have massive, robust immigration. And you know, sometimes the local media in our country, it takes a while to catch up to ethnic media that have people coming into this country. So how are you going to deal with C18? How is your industry going to catch up and make sure that new people coming into this country, in fact, get the message from your membership? Can you explain that?
Thank you for the question. Well, as it stands, we have been around. We are considered legacy media. My members have been around for 25, 50, over 70 years. And, very specific community outreach has always been the case. And we have newer members that are starting outlets as well and are getting membership or mentorship from the older outlets that have been around forever. So we are there. We are on top of it. We have over 800 members across this country. And you know what? It's been wonderful. And I'm proud to see that that we have made it this far.
Now to Mr. Geist. Dr. Geist, I flagged a long time ago, along with yourself, the huge Bell, Rogers, CBC, public broadcaster taking a lot of the money, and it was verified by the budget parliamentary officer. Nearly 75% of the money that will become available through Google and Facebook, Meta, will in fact go to the big industry players. I'm very concerned. My colleague Martin Shields and I have talked about the arbitration that these little newspapers in Canada really have no means of fighting when they do get to the table, if they in fact do get to the table with these giants. Your thoughts on that, because you've been very opinionated, I would say, of the three, along with myself, and I just want you to kind of back me up a little bit, if you don't mind.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, well, I have been vocal, and I have to say that I actually thought that the parliamentary budget officer's data, frankly, it took me by surprise. It wasn't included in the initial report. It only came a little while later in a link to an Excel spreadsheet. And I think that it took a lot of people by surprise to learn that slightly over 3/4 of the money by their estimate would go to large broadcasters. And I think that, a big chunk of that may well be from radio stations, which many of these broadcasters have. I must admit, I don't see the clear link between radio stations and what someone may post to Facebook or what we see in Google News. I mean, frankly, it just typically never even appears in that context, so it's not clear to me what's being compensated. And with respect to the CBC, I like the CBC. I think the CBC, I've long been an advocate.
30 seconds, Kevin.
I've long been an advocate to try to ensure that CBC content is as widely accessible and available as possible. Seems to me intermediaries that help ensure that that takes place are exactly what we want to see happen. The public has already paid for this content. And to have the CBC effectively now compete with local media, not just for digital ad dollars, but now compete as well for this pot of money, I think is harmful at the end of the day.
Dr. Geist.
I just did.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now we go to the Liberal Member of Parliament, Tim Lewis, for 6 minutes. Tim, please.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm going to yield my time to Ms. Hefner.
Certainly. Lisa, please, let me stop the clock here. Thank you. I'm going to go back. Lisa, begin for 6 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today. It's much appreciated, as my colleagues have indicated. And I would like to direct through you, Chair, my first questions to Randy Kitt of Unifor. A union I know represents many, many journalists across this country, including the employees of my former news employer. And I would like to say that I'm a big fan of the Local News Research Project, which you can find online. It was started in part by April Lindgren, who I remember as a very excellent head of the press gallery at Queen's Park before she went to teach journalism at Ryerson. And since 2008, they've been tracking all of the news organizations across the country that have closed. And we've learned that's about 500. News organizations that have closed. And Mr. Kitt, I'm wondering if you can describe for this committee what that has meant in terms of journalism jobs and what the future of journalism in this country would look like without legislation like C-18.
Thank you very much for the question. It's, as I said in my original statement, it's almost too late. I mean, we look at the big papers like the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Sun. Before I got here, we looked at those numbers. The Toronto Star, I think, was 600 and change, are now down to 178 members. That's, over 500 members walked out the door in the last 10 years. I remember talking to the unit chairs in that publication saying, like, the day the paper died and the people walked out and all of those journalism jobs. And so you look at 500 journalists walk out. Sure, lots of new publications are starting up, maybe 200, but those are 1 and 2 people here and there popping up, creating little tiny outlets. But when 500 people walk out the door in 10 years in one outlet, and that's the same at the Globe, not 70%. I think the Globe was 50 or 60%. The Toronto Sun, similar numbers. Just hundreds and hundreds of journalists leaving the business. It's just devastating. And so, yes, there's lots of new publications popping up, onesies and twosies over here and there. It's not filling the void.
And so what has that done to the quality and the amount of local news coverage in this country?
Yes, well, journalism is extremely expensive, and investigative journalism is expensive. And what we see is just less of it. The papers are smaller, the news online is less. I think our newspapers are doing a tremendous job pivoting to the new digital realities, but there's just less. There's less investigative news. There's less stories. We talk about, there's so many small towns and cities that just don't have reporters at City Hall. So many news deserts in this country. I was looking at the broadcasting news in New Brunswick for the C11 hearing and going through the list of stations in New Brunswick, and it turns out that most of their news comes from either Halifax or Toronto. Lethbridge has just announced that they are going to.
Thank you, Mr. Kitt. I think you made your point. It was an excellent point, and I appreciate it. I don't mean to cut you off. I just have very limited time.
I can go on and on.
And I'd like to move on to Professor Taylor Owen. You mentioned in your opening statement about how many other countries are looking to Canada now in our Bill C-18 when they're looking to craft their own legislation, including G7 nations, the UK, Indonesia, South Africa, New Zealand, the USA. Why do you believe there's such a growing international consensus, and why do you think C-18 is becoming a model for all these other countries?
Thanks for the question. Look, I think a lot of countries are looking at it because of the nature of these global platforms. A lot of countries are in the same position we are, and domestic journalism institutions in a wide range of countries are going through some of the same market challenges in their negotiations with platforms. Why I think they're looking at Canada is for two reasons. One, they saw the outcome of the Australian model, which we can debate the merits of that very particular articulation of this policy, but it did lead to a large amount of money flowing into publishers very quickly that proved a really valuable stopgap to real decline in the sector in Australia. But more importantly, I think they're looking to Canada because we have iterated, and I would argue in substantive ways, on the Australian model. I really do think it's a different model. We're not going through a competition bureau. The Australian model was quite crude. It provided one tool and one desired outcome. The regulatory model that's being proposed here is a substantive iteration on that, and one that I think other countries are taking seriously. I would not be at all surprised in the next year to see 4 or 5 countries implement the same.
Okay, just 30 seconds left, but I'd like you to follow up on your comment about exemption criteria. You said that these are the real levers that could really change the journalism market and the kind of journalism that we have here. Can you explain that a little bit further?
In the Australian model...
Please be short, Dr. Owen.
I can go back to this, but the exemption process in the Australian model was very crude and blunt and did not allow for targeted direction and oversight over how those monies were used. And the exemption criteria provides that in the Canadian model.
Thank you very much. And now I go to, from the Bloc Québécois, Martin Champoux. 6 minutes, please, Martin.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would also like to thank our witnesses for appearing before us today. My first question will be to Mr. Larose. I would like to, first of all, salute you. You are from a neighboring riding, and we had a representative from APTN who appeared before us earlier this year, so it's a pleasure to have you with us today. So, Mr. Larose, my question will be, I'm not going to talk about the relevance, but rather the reasons behind you wishing to add news enterprises, news companies from indigenous circles, indigenous peoples within the scope of this bill. Do you think that this will make a change in terms of the objective that's sought by this bill? What will it add to what's already existing in the bill? Well, I think, and many indigenous groups, including APTN, are of the same idea. What often happens is that indigenous communities are mostly more recent players in news. In the 1980s, as you would know, there was maybe 1 or 2 publications that they provided news about indigenous groups, indigenous circles, and then it started growing. So there is really no model or a model comparable that is in place that existed for other organizations. Apologies for interrupting, but my question is as follows. So C-18 is just installing a framework. So you are saying that we should have a bit more flexibility when it comes to the rules for indigenous media who otherwise wouldn't be eligible for bargaining. So isn't it in the general rules that we should adopt a more flexible approach for journalists and news outlets? So expanding rules generally and opening the door to a larger number of media outlets from a newer generation, for instance, from a newer model of news, would it, for instance, help others without specifically naming groups? Not that I'm against, but just as an idea. Well, there are organizations with just one journalist, and in my opinion, they should be eligible as well. But what we're trying to establish here is an environment in which we specifically recognize Indigenous news organizations, because they're not recognized. When we look at the content of the bill, you see that Indigenous news businesses are almost mentioned as an afterthought or at a lower level in the hierarchy of things, as is the case for ethnic groups, ethnic communities. So when we talk about local news, when we say local, it should also include ethnic newspapers and Indigenous newspapers, and they should have the same access to bargaining, the same rights for bargaining when it comes to arbitration and other tools envisaged by the bill with companies such as Meta and Google. So the emphasis we're placing here is specifically on identifying the needs of Indigenous communities and Indigenous journalists. Well, listen, Mr. LaRose, I'm hearing the point you're making, so it's just specifically the wording that you're looking for, but what we need to do is to make sure that all groups are represented in these newer models of journalism. I fully agree with you on that. I also want to ask a question to Mr. Kitt from Unifor. In your opening remarks, you were saying that no eligible media should be left behind, and you're talking about eligible media. But listening to what Mr. LaRose just said, and other groups are saying the same thing as well, should we maybe take into account newer models of journalism and not exclude those because it's just a newer model and not a traditional, better established model? So should we exclude these sorts of businesses? So what's your position on admissible businesses? Should we expand the criteria and open ourselves up to newer models?
Thank you for the question. We do say eligible news outlets, and the QCGO is a sort of known quantity of what makes an eligible news outlet. This bill, I think, also gives the CRTC the ability to expand on that, to include those who aren't eligible under the QCGO terms. That includes broadcasters and podcasters. But I think he also just said recently that he is open to allowing smaller news outlets to join in, and that means reducing the two journalist criteria and looking at that. So yeah, we would be open to that.
Merci, Monsieur Kitt.
Thank you, Mr. Kitt. I think I have about 40 seconds to ask a question. Thank you. A question to Dr. Owen. We have heard about this willingness that the deals should be made public, but in the business world, these sorts of deals are usually kept as a secret and they're not made public for the most part, and that's sometimes the reason why the deal is made. So would it help journalism organizations who are bargaining to know what the decisions are in other deals? I mean, I know I've taken up a lot of time asking the question, but maybe in a few seconds.
I wonder if when Mr. Owen gets another chance, he can answer that question, please, because we're over time. And maybe Peter Julian might be so kind as to do that. Peter, you're next up for the NDP for 6 minutes, please.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair, and thanks to all our witnesses for being coming forward today. Mr. Kitt, I would like to start with you, and Mr. Wameed took about a third of his question period for a statement, so I would like to preface my questions with a statement coming from the National Post, an editorial this morning that talked about the threats by Meta to withdraw services similar to what we saw in Australia. And the National Post editorial, and I quote, said, "The Conservative members of the Heritage Committee did a disservice to their constituents and Canadian democracy as a whole by giving far too much deference to a company using fear tactics to try to escape its obligations to the media companies it has spent years siphoning revenues from. So my question to you, Mr. Kitt, first off is, how important is it that we push back against these fear tactics? And secondly, you raised issues around inclusivity, accountability, and transparency. The question I would ask on that side is, to what extent the bill needs to be improved to ensure that particularly the accountability and transparency is present at all levels?
Thanks, Peter. I think we saw Facebook try to flex his muscle in Australia, and we see how that ended up for them. And this is exactly why we're in this position, because these companies have so much marketplace power, and it just shows the abuse of power that has to be stopped. And Bill C-18, I think, is one step to leveling the playing field. As for inclusivity, I think I want to touch on Michael Geist's comment on why broadcasters should get contributions, because we applaud the government for making this bill platform agnostic, and journalism is journalism, whether it's print, digital, or in a podcast or a broadcast. It's simply a matter of bandwidth that print journalism was affected first, and now that the internet can easily handle video on all the networks, broadcast is equally effective. Facebook and Google profit from broadcast news just the same as print journalism, and so they should also be included. And everybody loves to hate the big telcos. We know that, Bell, Rogers, and Quebecor, but they employ a lot of journalists, and those journalists tell our stories. And so not including them would be a disservice. This is about fixing the entire ecosystem, and that includes players big and small.
And when you reference inclusivity, you're talking about a broadening of the definition so that local valid community news outlets can actually be part of this solution, right?
Exactly. We're not, Unifor is not saying who should be included. I think the QCJO sets out the great standards, and the CRTC is also going to have some leeway to allow inclusivity.
Thanks so much, Mr. Kitt. I'd like to move to Dr. Owen now. The same question in terms of these threats from Meta that have been decried far and wide, how important it is to push back against the threats. And my second question to you, and I think I've got an accurate quote, when you referenced the issues of ensuring that they don't increase false or misleading sources, that the bill has to ensure that. My quote that I've have from your comment is, clarity on non-discrimination is an easy fix. So if you could clarify what you see as the fix to ensure that looking at false or misleading sources, particularly from the far right, we've seen the rise of far right disinformation. How do we ensure in the bill that we get that right?
Thank you for both questions. I mean, on the easy fix, I think in section 51, a sentence can just be added about the indexing and ranking of variable news through usual course of search engine optimization not be considered undue or unreasonable advantage. I mean, I think it's a bit of a straw man there. I think that we can fix quite easily, or could be fixed quite easily. Look, on Facebook in Australia, I know this committee has discussed what happened there in some detail, so I don't think it's worth sort of recounting. But I would just want to correct one statement that was just made, which is Facebook threatened to turn off news in Australia, certainly, but I actually think they won in some respects. They got some fairly significant concessions in that bill. So I think it's worth sort of just observing the power that they exerted, and the goals, the stated goals internally, which we now know from the whistleblowers report about it, were achieved. So it was an exertion of power, but it was also a meaningful outcome on their regard. And coming back to the question about exemption criteria, it actually is what differentiates the Canadian approach, I think, to the Australian one, in that when you have a very binary view of designation, like there was in Australia, there was a lot of leeway on what on the criteria that platforms could use to not be designated to be exempted. That's going to be much more difficult here because there's specific criteria they have to meet, and they have to report against those criteria to the regulator. And they will be adjudicated on that basis, perhaps even in a public hearing of some sort. So I think that protects us to a certain degree from that kind of behavior. But I do think the threat is real and, in my view, egregious.
Thank you very much, Peter. That's it. That's it. Nice try, though. That's it. Now we're going to go to the second round, which is a 5-minute round. And again, please try and be as clear and concise with your questions and your answers. Thank you. Now we're going to go to Marilyn Gladue for the Conservative Party. Marilyn, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. Obviously, the goal of C18 is to try to protect the smaller and local media outlets that have been under such attack and diminished, and I support that. I just don't think that this bill is actually going to achieve it, especially when I hear that Bell and CBC and Rogers are going to end up with 3/4 of the money. So I sort of liked Mr. Kitt's initial idea where he said, I thought at the beginning, the government should levy a fee on the large ones and put it into a news fund that, you could have, the journalists across the country figure out who gets what. So Mr. Kitt, just expanding on that, would you think that that would have been better than what we have today? And if you don't agree, then I guess, how do we address the making sure that all the small and local folks are included? Do we, drop you have to have 2 journalists minimum? Do we drop the general news focus so that ethnic and diverse media can be included? What would you suggest?
I don't think there's a one-stop. I think another witness said this already. There's not a one-stop solution to the fundamental problems that journalism is facing right now. Yes, a news fund, I think, is a great idea. And the LGI, I think the Public Policy Forum is working on a proposal to expand the LGI news fund that could also include philanthropy and other governments chipping in, and that's a fund that folks could work off of. That's coming up in 2 years. C18, we proposed, by the way, a hybrid model at one point. I think a news fund is a great idea. I think C18 addresses a lot of our issues. Like I said, the CRTC will deal with eligibility. I think the government has given them directive on that. And so C18 is one step. We got to get this passed because these news outlets are bleeding money, and that's that's broadcast and print.
I do take your point, Mr. Kitt. Can I ask just one question? Is the QCJO definition of who's a qualified journalist organization better to use than, for example, the list of journalistic organizations that's found in the Income Tax Act?
I'm no expert on those criteria. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. I'll go next to Mr. Owen. Actually, Mr. Owen, did you have any consultations with the Minister of Heritage's office or departments before you appeared with us today?
No, not about this in particular.
Because I was surprised to see you on the list because you've received direct funding from them, and over the last number of years, you've received thousands of dollars for your organization. So do you not think it's a bit of a conflict of interest for you to appear on the minister's bill?
I mean, I'm not sure I appreciate the tone of that, frankly. I mean, my research institution at university has received funding through the Digital Citizens Initiative, as have hundreds of organizations across this country. So if none of those organizations are capable of speaking to a bill on which they have academic expertise, then I think our public policy debate is greatly diminished in this country.
Thank you. And for Maria, I liked the idea of changing the definition to make sure that we can include all the ethnic publishers they're coming in. Do you have a recommendation of wording that you'd like to see in the bill?
Well, the thing to acknowledge is that the only difference between us and official language media is that we traditionally report in a third language. So, the only thing, well, not the only thing, but a very, very important thing to consider here is the, changing the owner, operator, journalist to be, part of that qualification. That is going to be huge. Our outlets a lot of them are mom and pops.
No, I appreciate that. I think that's good. And for Mr. Geist, I'm concerned when I hear that there's a constitutional problem with the DNI definition that we have, and now you've mentioned a copyright law that we may be infringing 10.1 of the Berne Convention. What will happen if the bill's passed without fixing those things?
Well, I think
30 seconds, Mr. Geist.
Sure, I'll try to go quick. And there's, I think, a lot to talk about with respect to copyright, which hasn't received, I think, the attention that it deserves. I think it's a real problem for, especially a bill that comes out of Heritage that focuses so much on copyright, especially a journalism bill that depends upon fair dealing as part of what journalism is all about, to undermine that and essentially say that certain groups aren't entitled to exercise the limitations and exceptions that the Supreme Court of Canada has said are user rights. Layer on top of that the clear requirement.
Thank you, Mr. Geist.
Sure.
You have now have gone well over time, so you may be able to answer that in another round when someone else asks a question. Thank you very much. So we now go to the Liberals, Tim Lewis. Tim, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll direct all my questions to you. I want to thank the witnesses for being here in person and online as well. Maybe I'd start with Ms. Saras Vutsinas, the Executive Director from the National Ethnic Press and Media Council of Canada. In my riding, our local newspapers did not stop during the pandemic. Ethnic press did not stop during the pandemic in my region, and indeed across Canada. So I wanted to take this opportunity to thank your members, indeed all local news outlets across Canada, for providing that vital public health and public safety information during the pandemic. Your quote in your opening testimony said that readership surged, but advertising cratered. And then also in your opening statement, you said that Facebook earns about $200 million from Canada ad revenue. And that's what this legislation is trying to do, trying to level that playing field. So I wanted to see if I can clear this up. In your opening statement, I believe you said there were no deals that you have made yet. How many members of your organization have made deals with the tech platforms?
As far as I'm aware, 0.
And well, ultimately what we're looking for is fair negotiations. So I wanted to refer to those small players and the collective bargaining framework that's in the bill. We heard testimony from one of the witnesses who said, quote, I think smaller players just don't have the bargaining power, that they don't have the time and that they don't have the energy, that they're not big enough to support that kind of negotiation needed, close quote. Yet we've also heard that similar legislation implemented in Australia has shown strong benefits that happened quickly for those small news outlets. So would you care to respond to those comments? And do you believe that this bill's provisions would lead these smaller players to incur that heavier burden and help you with the obvious imbalance that exists without this legislation between the small publishers and internet giants?
Absolutely. But in Australia alone, I believe there was 24 ethnic and LGBTQ outlets that were able to strike deals, which is fantastic news for us. And, what we're looking for is a collective negotiation. That's why we've been working very closely with News Media Canada so that, we work out a way where at least 35% of newsroom salaries are covered by this bill. And I think collectively, it makes a lot more sense.
You mentioned News Media Canada. The committee previously heard from News Media Canada that the trade association that represents a large number of small players across the country, that they're going to form a collective bargain together where each member provides editorial expenses confidentially to a law firm. Then they'd negotiate collectively with the platforms, and any settlements from the collective negotiation would be shared among publishers on a pro rata basis. Do you believe this is achievable, and is this a strong model?
I do, absolutely. I definitely have faith in that process.
Well, that's fantastic. And last week, we heard some witnesses and even testimony from my colleagues across the other Conservative MPs advocating for a possible establishment of a fund, a tax I imagine, on tech giants that would contribute to where they would actually be under no regulatory scrutiny. My understanding is that the government already has a number of measures targeted for the smaller players. In addition to this legislation we're looking for, we have the Canadian Periodical Fund, local journalism initiative is also mentioned today. Can you speak to the importance of these other streams of funding for your members and how they would complement legislation like C-18?
The other sources of funding have been a lifeline, especially the Special Measures for Journalism Fund, which was open to free publications, which a majority of my members are in their communities. Again, they've all been a lifeline. The Local Journalism Initiative, another one, it was never meant to be a pandemic measure. However, it gave the smaller outlets an opportunity to hire journalists to come on board and to reach communities that traditionally they weren't able to reach due to you not having the funding there. They've been exceptional and a big reason why we've been able to make it to this point.
30 seconds, guys.
In 30 seconds, I won't be able to answer questions, so I'll just say thank you again to everyone for being here on this important legislation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. And we now go to Martin Champoux from the Bloc Québécois for 2.5 minutes, please, Martin.
Madame la Présidente, je vais prendre la parole.
Madam Chair, I will take over for Mr. Champoux, if you allow me. I think Mr. Champoux agrees. Okay, thank you. Thank you to our witnesses. Thanks for being with us today. It's very important for us. I have a question, very simple to Mr. Owen. So when we speak against the GAFAMs, and we've seen this with C11, there's been a lot of debate on that now with C18. We're hearing these voices louder and louder that these are attacks against the freedom of expression. So, Dr. Owen, do you share this opinion? So C11 and C18, do they undermine the freedom of expression in Canada?
I don't want to speak to C11, as that's not the topic of this discussion, but I don't think that C18 does, no.
Okay. Merci, Monsieur Owen.
Thank you, Mr. Owen. You wrote in the Gazette a text that says the following: Internet platforms are not designed to give us quality information. They're calibrated to maximize the capturing of attention and the profits, of course. So do you think C18 can inverse the trend? And we have heard that the bill will increase this information. What do you think about that?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the start. That was directed to me, correct?
Yeah. All right, I will pause.
Oui, je vais recommencer.
I will go again. So you wrote a text in the Gazette that says the following: Internet platforms are not designed to provide quality information. They are calibrated to maximize grabbing people's attention and profits. So do you think that C18 turns this trend upside down according to what's proposed?
I don't think C18 is designed to, nor will it, reverse the trend of how the financial model and design of platforms preferences certain types of content over others. That in and of itself is its own dynamic that other policy mechanisms can get at, but that is not what this bill is designed to do. Now, can it help redistribute some of the ad funding dollars that are acquired through the distribution of content, including journalistic content by these platforms, to the publishers that create journalism? Yes, I think it could do that.
Merci.
Thank you. In the same article, you're talking about the rules on algorithms used by web giants to establish a healthy relationship between media and democracy. Can you give us a bit more detail on that?
Yeah, absolutely, but I actually think it's beyond the bounds of this bill. I think the opacity and the incentive structure and the design of the algorithmic systems that determine what we see and don't see on platforms should be the subject of a public policy conversation. But I don't think it is this one.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now we go to Peter Julian for 2.5 minutes, please, Peter.
Thank you very much, Ms. Chair. And I did want to come back on the Conservative attempt to link people who are receiving legitimate funding for the federal government as somehow something that should be brought at committee. We've had Conservative witnesses that get direct funding from big tech, and they are still able to testify despite that very clear conflict of interest. So I wanted to make that comment to start off, and then ask Ms. Sarah Voutsinas, thank you so much for being here today. Your organizational members do a huge service. We've seen this through the pandemic, often reaching a wide variety. In my community, there's over 150 languages spoken, and so many of the publications that are part of your organization have made a huge difference. And I know people have been struggling to keep those community newspapers that are in languages other than official languages alive. How important is it to have an owner-operator component so that people can access that funding even if the journalists are also owner-operators? And if we don't put that component into the bill, what percentage of your publications members do you think would not be able to participate or may even shut down?
I believe a large number of my membership will not be able to meet the criteria. Unfortunately, we're at a point right now, just because of the lack in funding coming in and advertising revenue, where the owner-operators are the journalists. And a lot of these are family businesses as well, including my own. My father started our Greek Canadian newspaper 50 years ago. And, because of the hand I was given, I am also an owner-operator of the newspaper as well. So it's literally night and day having that designation.
Oh, congratulations on your 50th anniversary, by the way. That's extraordinary.
It is.
Peter, you have 11 seconds left.
So just understanding, what percentage of your members, if that definition is not changed, will be not able to participate?
I would estimate 75%. It will be that high.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sarah Spittin. Now, I would like to move to the Conservatives for 5 minutes. Martin Shields, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Geist, my father started a weekly newspaper, and he was the only journalist, so he would have never qualified for this. Then we've got, as many weekly papers have told me, that the Fed advertising money is all gone to the foreign, so our taxpayers' money is going to those foreign big guys. If they said they'd give it back to us, they'd be fine. But I mean, we got 40 million more given to the CBC yesterday that already gets 1.2 billion, yet none of that will go to my weekly newspapers and my writings. You've talked about a lot of things possibly, and you didn't get a chance to talk about the copyright. And that's a huge issue that we've kicked around in a number of committees here on the Hill. Would you like to get into that one?
Thanks for that question.
I would like to suggest that we are dealing with C18 and not with copyright.
It is.
So if Mr. Geist can answer as quickly or as succinct to the topic that we're dealing with, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, but there's a full section on copyright in the bill, and I'm referring specifically to Section 24 in the bill.
Which go ahead then.
Thank you. Which has the effect of removing limitations and exceptions from the prospect of negotiation. I think it's important to recognize that we need to ask the question, what exactly is being compensated here? I don't believe that it can simply be that we're compensating because one set of companies have done well and another set of companies are struggling. We didn't ask Netflix to pay Blockbuster because they came up with a better model. So what we're compensating is use, and it talks about use here. If what we were talking about was full publication of these works, then I think you could credibly say that if you're copying, if you're at Facebook or Google, and you're copying full text, we'd like to see compensation. And I actually believe that's what the agreements that they've reached with these publications are for. That's why they're commercial agreements different from the agreements we see in this bill. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about full publication. We're talking about something as simple as a link. And a link, I would argue, is, from a copyright perspective, certainly not an act of republication. And even further than that, the kind of use that is being used with this link is clearly permitted under the Copyright Act. I'd argue, frankly, it may not even fall there, in part because it's so de minimis. It just doesn't even rise to the level of a substantial use. But if it does, this is clearly fair dealing. And the Supreme Court of Canada has said this is a user's right that is core to our copyright law. For this legislation to say that those rules simply don't apply to a particular class of users scares me. What happens when you then turn around and say education isn't entitled to this? What happens when you say other groups, certain large publications aren't entitled to this, they should be compensating? I think that we rely upon, and journalists rely upon, fair dealing. And so that insertion in the Copyright Act, which I should note does not appear in the Australian legislation, is a mistake that should be removed.
Thank you. You also mentioned the possibility of different ways to get into the financial aspect rather than the linked money. And you were suggesting you didn't get an opportunity to say the ways you would do it other than the way they're talking about compensation now.
Thanks. We've had several people talk about the fund model, and quite frankly, the fund model is not the same as some of those existing funds. I think those existing funds that we've already heard about are quite positive, and I think they've had a real positive effect, which is why you see over the last couple of years essentially a balance between new startups and entities that have been closing. But a fund model here that would require the Facebooks and Googles to contribute. It could be on the basis of the revenues that they're generating, or it could just be from general tax revenues. There's a number of ways that you can try to do that. Removes a whole series of issues, because now you're funding journalism. You get rid of these eligibility criteria questions, because anybody's eligible to apply so long as what they're doing is actively engaged in journalism. You get rid of some of the other questions about why is all this money going to broadcasters? Well, if broadcasters are producing this stuff and putting in applications out of a fund, then they'd be able to get it. But it levels the playing field for who has access, removes the questions around the lack of transparency on these deals, and removes the influence that some of these companies have over those issues. And so I think, frankly, it's a far better model that gets rid of many of the concerns that have been raised in this context and gets to the heart of what I hear the government saying they want to achieve, which is to support more journalism. The fund could help, I think, do that without some of the negative externalities that are coming out of this particular bill.
And that's, I suppose,
30 seconds, Mr. Shields.
The transparency issue you talked about is to have that as transparent as possible.
We should be clear on transparency. Everyone talks about how this bill is more transparent. The deals are still not public under this legislation. There's aggregate numbers that are made available. I suppose that there may be some benefit to that. The truth is some of these companies are public companies anyway, that we may be able to divine from some of their public statements the kind of benefits they're getting from this. This bill doesn't throw open the very deals that I keep hearing talked about at this committee. What an open system would do.
Please wrap up your answer, Dr. Geist.
I will, Chair.
Over time.
I will, Chair. What a fund would do would be create an open, transparent system where we would see who is the beneficiary and specifically what kind of journalism is being funded.
Thank you very much. I now go to the Liberal member, who is Ms. Julie Zerowitz. Julie, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and it's such a pleasure for me to be at committee today. And so I want to thank all the witnesses as well for being here today. It's very important for us to hear your testimony. Ms. Saras, I don't know how to say your last name, Maria, but thanks so much for being here. We haven't seen you since Finance Committee. Thanks for all your unbelievable work. And Dr. Geist, Professor Geist and Professor Owen, I'll say to you, I read both of your works. Everything that you guys write, I read, it's very thoughtful. And maybe Professor Owen, I'm going to start off with you and maybe continue the conversation that we just finished off. In the past, I believe you've argued and supported a fund model, and I know many others have. And if I heard your comments correctly, you have now evolved to supporting the bargaining framework. So maybe if you could talk a little bit more about why is the bargaining framework a more appropriate policy?
I'm not sure I'd go so far as to say it's more appropriate. I think at this moment, it's more feasible, both legally, practically, and politically. I agree with Professor Geist that there's an elegance to the fund model, and I agree with a lot of the things he's argued about it, and many other academics who've promoted it as well in other jurisdictions. I see a couple of challenges with it here, though, in actually implementing it. One is that, so there's two ways you can put money into a fund. You could create a dedicated tax on platforms, which I have learned, I'm not a lawyer, but I've learned that could be very complicated legally to do a dedicated tax on a subset of companies in terms of existing trade agreements. So if that's not possible, then it has to come from general revenue. And if you build a fund coming from general revenue, then someone somewhere in the government, like we did with the labor tax subsidy, needs to decide what money to put in, what the criteria for that money being given will be. And in my view, both of those things are far more intrusive government role in the journalism sector than the fund. They're both far more intrusive. And given the context in which we're having the debate about this bill in particular, which I actually think is far less intrusive, I find it very unlikely that many of the people who are arguing for a fund and have been arguing for a fund through this debate would actually support that greater involvement of government in the journalism sector. So for those two reasons, I think it's fundamentally difficult. Now, that being said, I actually think other jurisdictions are going to try it in all likelihood. There's models for this potentially being implemented internationally if it's a global type of fund for global journalism, and I think that's interesting. And I actually think, as was mentioned earlier, it could be an additive thing that for some, potentially for local journalism organizations, that model could be applied in other ways. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive necessarily, and I think that right now, it's incredibly difficult to imagine that fund being stood up in a meaningful way in Canada.
Okay, thanks so much, Professor Owen. And I want to make sure that we heard your full response, just because I think it was important for us to get all the details. So I appreciate you going into depth on that. You were talking a little bit earlier about how there are currently financial agreements between certain platforms and news publishers, and they're not transparent at all. And when I was doing a little bit of research and a little bit of reading up before I came to a committee today, I was noticing how some previous witnesses were highlighting that there was a bit of a double speak when it comes to this. So I think there are certain times when you have your online platforms talking about the financial agreements that they've made behind closed doors with news publishers. They call it commercial licensing agreements, but when they are being mandated by law, as we are proposing through C18, they're calling it a link tax. What are your thoughts on this?
Look, I think there's what I'm most concerned about is that there's large amounts of money flowing from platforms to publishers in the Canadian media market under terms that are unknown to the public and unaccountable to government. And in a market that is essential, in my view, for the functioning of a democratic society, the terms of those deals and that funding model need to be as accountable as possible. Now, does that mean they can be entirely transparent? Probably not. And I think there's legitimate reasons why they can't be entirely opened up. But I do think the terms of those
wrap
deals
up your answer, Dr. Owen.
Yep,
Thank you.
can be accountable to the public via reporting, can be given to an arbitrator so that deals are distributed more equitably and more fairly, and can be provided in aggregate way to publishers as they enter into these negotiations, so everybody gets a similar fair deal.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think that time is up, Julie. I'm going to go to a third round, but I just wanted to warn everyone that we can finish a third round if everyone is as concise in their questions and their answers. Because I don't know if the clerk can tell me if we have a hard stop at 1 o'clock. And I know that a lot of people have other things going on after 1 o'clock. So we do have a hard stop. So I'm going to begin my third round, and I will go to the Conservatives with John Nader. Welcome back, John. It's so nice to have you with us again. Begin for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it is wonderful to be back with Heritage Committee this week. I want to begin by echoing the comments of my Conservative colleague, Kevin Waugh, from his opening comments. Certainly, I think Kevin hit the nail on the head in terms of where we stand on this piece of legislation and overall our support for journalism and news media. And I just might add, since we have Mr. Kitt here from Unifor, I just wanted to point out as well that Brother Kevin is a 39-year member of Unifor, so certainly a long time participant in the industry. So it's really nice to have Kevin's expertise on this committee. I want to start with Professor Geist, and I will also give Professor Owen a response or an opportunity to respond to my first question as well. And that's about the idea of innovation within the news media industry. And certainly we've seen, particularly in the last few years, new, different, and innovative models in terms of how Canadians receive the news and how different providers provide the news. So I'm curious to hear from both of you, and start with Professor Geist, what your thoughts are on where innovation fits into C18 and how that may play a role in terms of new entrants into the news media and journalistic market. So I'll start with you, Professor Geist, and then I'll give Professor Owen a chance to respond as well.
Sure. Well, thanks for that. I think we have seen a huge amount of innovation. In this sector, I run a regular podcast. I've had some of the entities that are servicing local communities engaged in this. Ms. Hepner mentioned the local journalism project that April Lindgren has involved with, and she, through that project, has identified hundreds of new startups that have occurred during the same period of time. And frankly, I think it's unfortunate to belittle it as being just mom and pop shops or 1 and 2 people. In many instances, these, I think, will be the future of servicing in some of these communities. In fact, there are communities where it is one of the lead sources. Some of those startups have said this is not the approach they would like to see happen. In fact, they worry about the prospect of seeing news sharing curtailed because they see some of those large platforms more in the context of being partners as opposed to being adversarial. But I do think that innovation piece is important. And so I worry when we see eligibility criteria that may exclude many of those kinds of innovative startups. And I worry when we take a look at the PBO's estimates that almost all the money is going to well-established players. I mean, at the end of the day, if we want to see that next generation of innovation, it's not just about supporting some of the legacy players, some of whom may have struggled to adapt into this environment. It's those that have embraced it and are finding new ways to deliver. And so I think there's a lot of exciting stuff that is taking place, and I worry about legislation that purports to level the playing field, but in fact does anything but.
Thank you. And Professor Owen?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the chance to jump in here. I mean, look, I couldn't agree more that the future of Canadian journalism is going to come from the network of small journalism organizations and journalism startups who are innovating the model of news. There's absolutely no doubt about that in my mind. That being said, the idea that we should be pitting and positioning small publishers and independent publishers against the large publishers as if they have fundamentally different objectives and values and financial interests is to me a real a disappointing side effect of the debate we've been having, or implication of the debate we've been having about C18. And I think we have to move beyond that. So look, are there legitimate concerns? Of course that small publishers and independent publishers have raised about this bill. I think lowering that exemption, lowering the eligibility criteria to include owner proprietors makes a ton of sense. The allocation of money thing is also a bit tricky because at the moment, if you have a baseline fair allocation that's prorated by FTE or prorated by the amount of journalism that's being done, the bigger players are going to get more. Now, is that 75% or 60%? I don't know the exact way that was measured and what we're including in that in the PBO estimate. But of course, the big publishers, if they have a lot more journalists, they are going to get a greater percentage of the money. Does that mean that getting a significant subsidy for a 1 or 2 person operation isn't a meaningful contribution to that small operation and potentially allows them to innovate and continue to grow, I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive. The final thing I think is really important to note is that right now, why the status quo is important is of those independent publishers, only a small fraction are getting deals right now. And I think this scenario, particularly with the collective bargaining provisions and the provisions that allow for people to be added to collective agreements after the fact, that would include a much wider range of small organizations, if not anybody who wanted it, just like the KCJO does.
Thank you very much, Dr. Owen. And now I would like to go to the Liberals, Anthony Housefather. Anthony, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And my first question is going to be to Dr. Geist and Professor Owen. And basically, sorry for this, I'm a lawyer, and our amendments are due November the 10th. And I actually am interested in the baseball arbitration part of this, both because I like baseball and because I think it's an important part of the equation. Dr. Geist, you have written, and I'm going to quote you so that I get it fairly right. Yet Section 39 gives the arbitration panel the right to reject an offer on several policy grounds. Why would such a provision be necessary in a final arbitration system that encourages submitting your best offer? It is only necessary if you fear one side will examine the evidence and proffer a low offer on the grounds that it does not believe that there has been a demonstration of comparable value. But I would agree with you, certainly if this was a baseball type arbitration where you were throwing at a salary number and the entire proposal was a salary number. But the way I read Section 39, this is where I want your take in terms of wording. It says an arbitration panel must dismiss any offer that, in its opinion, A, allows a party to exercise undue influence over the amount of compensation to be paid or received, and I'll just stick with B, A and B, is not in the public interest because the offer would be highly likely to result in serious detriment to the provision of news content to persons in Canada. So based on how Facebook came here last week, let's say, for example, that Facebook provided a number which is a high number, and they said, but as part of that high number, you are not allowed to write articles that are critical of Facebook, and you have to publish glowing testimony about Mark Zuckerberg 3 times a month. To me, that is the reason why you have a Section 39, because it's taking things that are extraneous to the actual offer, that are not in the news media's best interest, certainly, and definitely not, and definitely could allow Facebook to exercise influence over the other party. So can I come back to you and say, based on that type of an approach, wouldn't this then be a reasonable thing to have there if it was limited to things like that?
Thanks. It's a great question. I'll say a couple things. First, there is a C, which talks about fairness in the marketplace, and it's or, so it's any of those criteria that apply. But I think even more than that, if we are saying that we trust in the CRTC and then by extension trust in the arbitration panel that gets established, if they were to come in with completely their lowball offer was not just a lowball offer in terms of the financial compensation, but lowball in the sense that they attached all kinds of what we might see as unacceptable conditions, as opposed to an offer on the other side that was seen as fairer and doesn't have that. Well, then it seems to me to be a bit of a slam dunk that the panel will take a look at that, reject the Facebook offer, and say, we're going to take that other one. That's the whole point of this system. And to that ability to intervene, and where I have a concern where this comes up, is that I think that the parties could look at this and say, we don't see value on links. If anything, we see value of links going the other direction. So here's our offer. It's viewed as low, and it doesn't achieve the broader objectives that I know the government has for this legislation.
I'm going to come to you next, Professor Owen. So just coming back, so your opinion would be that Section 38 in itself is sufficient for the panel to make a decision related to such a crazy, let's say even if it's a higher offer, right? Like, let's say it's not a lowball offer. Let's say it's a very high offer. They go to want to pay off the whole news media to write glowing things about them. You would say that that still is enough under 38, and 39 then should not be there because 38 is sufficient. Yeah, that's your position. Okay.
Yeah, listen, as you know, I've got issues with the legislation, but I think that you could remove 39 and remain true to the final arbitration process.
Professor Owen, can I just ask you to comment on that?
1 minute.
Sorry. Professor Owen,
I don't disagree with any of that.
Sorry, I didn't get you. What you said, sorry?
I don't disagree with any of that. My broader belief is that the arbitration process should be maximally inclusive of the terms of deals that the publishers and platforms come to.
Mr. Maurice, Madam Chair, wanted to ask a brief question. If I have 30 seconds, I'm going to give it to him.
Yes, okay. Mr. Maurice, be quick because your 30 seconds is winding down.
Thank you, Mr. Housefather, and thank you, Chair. I actually have a question to Dr. Geist or Dr. Owens. In terms of the less than 25% that the PBO is saying is going to smaller newspapers, do you have a suggested amendment that would help to address that?
Yeah, my view would be the CBC should be excluded from the process altogether. The legislation already recognizes the need for regulations to include them. And so I would say, for example, that they would only be eligible if regulations are established at a minimum, is one way to try to address that part of it.
Thank you, Dr. Geist. Dr. Owen does not have any opportunity to answer that question because we have gone over time. So I would again ask witnesses and questioners to please be as concise as you can so that we can have everybody have input. Thank you very much. So now I'm going to the Bloc Québécois, Martin Champoux, 2.5 minutes, please, Martin.
Merci, Madame la
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will come back to a question asked to Mr. Owen previously about transparency that is requested by a lot of organizations when it comes to sharing the contents of the deals. So Mr. Owen, I'm not convinced that large media companies and groups that come together to bargain with the giants of the internet, I don't think they would have a big advantage by sharing or exposing the contents of their bargaining. So would there be any other reasons do you think they would hesitate to share the contents of the bargains?
It depends what they're being asked to share and with whom. If it's with the public, I think we've seen that there's clear hesitation to share the nature of these commercial arrangements between private actors. And I think that's a very legitimate position for them to take at the moment. The question for me on transparency, I mean, Professor Geist is right. Like, transparency gets thrown around as this like universal good that let's just make it transparent and then it will be okay. And I don't think that's the case. I think there are very particular reasons for wanting and objectives to different types of transparency in this policy. So for one, I think the public should have maximum legal view into the nature of these deals. And that's part of the reporting process that I actually think should be more regular and more extensive and spelled out in legislation rather than left purely to regulation.
Donc, si c'était un organisme.
So if this was an organization that had all the elements of the deal, at that point they would be able to come to a judgment as to whether it is compatible or fair in terms of what's generally done in the industry. Would that be envisageable or doable for you?
Yes, that's the second piece, I think, the second objective. So the first is public accountability. So we should all, as publics who consume this journalism, get some access into the nature of the funding agreements. Great. But the arbitrator who's deciding the outcomes of these negotiations, these deals, needs a far greater view into their detail. And that, I don't think there's commercial prerogatives that would limit the sharing of that data to a regulator. But then a third piece that I think is really important here is the individual publishers themselves would benefit from a greater degree of transparency over the deals that others have received. Because when we talk about the independent publishers in particular right now, they're at a real disadvantage. So publishers who have not reached deals do not know what other companies have gotten. And it allows the publishers to be played off each other. And some degree of visibility into those deals will substantially increase the equity of what everyone enters into.
Merci,
Monsieur Owen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Owen. Thank you very much.
I'm glad for one reason that we don't have to follow the John Native formula on this particular committee hearing. So now I'm going to go to Peter Julian. Peter, 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I will ask my final questions to Mr. Larose. So, more or less the same questions I've asked everyone. So, we are faced with threats from large tech companies, and one of the reasonings behind C18 is just to fight against us. And I can see clearly that you are proposing that we should refer to Indigenous journalists and Indigenous media outlets, and there is currently no definition that answers the needs of Indigenous communities. Do you think that C18, as it is presented right now, provides the opportunity to journalists from Indigenous communities to engage in a bargaining process so that they are able to produce more journalism for these communities? Currently, we believe that the bill is drafted in such a way as to provide a lower level of opportunities to Indigenous communities. It is very important for us to be considered on an equal footing. Indigenous journalism or media outlets are just as important as mainstream media outlets or journalism. Their business model and the sustainability of how Indigenous organizations function, these are not issues covered in the bill as is. So the two, mainstream and Indigenous journalism, should be given the equal recognition, if you will. And as far as I know, there is no Indigenous publication that has entered into a bargaining process or has been able to strike a deal. So I think the bill should address, because it is not this in equal situations. So this is of essential importance for you then? Yes, because I have. So I think this is essential because there has been no deal struck to date. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Now I will go to the Conservatives for 5 minutes. Kevin Waugh. Kevin, you have 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. My questions will be to Randy Kitt of Unifor. Tell me again why CBC, Bell, and Rogers should be involved in C18. CBC, $1.2 billion this year in funding, plus yesterday in the fall economic statement, they're getting additional $42 million. Bell Media, which I worked for 39 years, the stock price today is $61.35. Rogers, $41.73 stock price today. Why would we allow these three media conglomerates into this bill? You know, and I know because you're with Unifor, and I was with Unifor for decades. Bell Media is shutting radio stations down by the month, and yet they could be on the receiving end of C18. So why is that fair to the rest of the media in this country trying to compete with Bell, Rogers, and CBC?
Oh, thank you for the question. I would suggest, why shouldn't the broadcasters be included? And we applaud the government for making this bill platform agnostic. You know, Facebook and Google profit from broadcast news just the same as print journalism. And just to echo Professor Owen's comments, is that pitting the smaller journalist organizations against the bigger journalist organizations is counterproductive in this forum. We love to hate the big telcos. We can look at their share prices, but we know that the issue right here is Facebook and Google paying for and compensating these outlets for news, big or small. And the big players, whether they be broadcast or whether they be in print, employ a lot of people, and they make a lot of journalism, local and otherwise. And they should be compensated on scale for that.
Let me
for their efforts.
Yep, let me say this, because I agree. Facebook, Google should be compensating other media in this country. I totally agree with you. Tell me why then Bell Media shut Prince Albert when they had 85 Unifor members in Prince Albert years ago. They're down to one reporter now. They shut down Yorkton, CKOS. They're down to one reporter when they had over 40 people. Now we're going to give them money for what? Are they going to reopen Prince Albert and Yorkton? Or is the head office in Montreal going to decide, we'll just take the money and decide where to put it ourselves? Because I can tell you, and Unifor knows very well, there will be no more jobs in Prince Albert. There'll be no more additional jobs in Yorkton. I don't know what Bell Media is going to do with the money they'll get from Facebook and Google, but as a longtime Unifor member, I'm going to tell you, I don't see Prince Albert opening up to a full newsroom, and nor do I see Yorkton opening up. And you're responsible for this because Unifor is fighting for members. And yet, can you not see what I'm saying in the last several months here with C-18? This bill will destroy medium and small companies in this country.
Am I on here?
You're on.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Kitt.
I'm just going to quote here. Since 2012, private conventional TV has been a big money loser for 9 years straight. They've lost 2020 minus 7%. 2019 -7. 2020 -18.6, and last year they lost 12.4%. These losses are real to our members, and we love to hate. I'm going to say it again: Bell, Rogers, and Shaw, but they're not so rich that we should just assume they're going to continue to fund local news as they continue to lose money. So, and I want to.
They're not so rich. Hold on now. They own television networks in Canada. They own a Blue Jays baseball club, Raptors. And you're telling me Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, owned by both Rogers and Bell, is suffering? Give me a break. You don't believe what you just said, do you?
The numbers are there. They're losing money.
30 seconds.
Well, the last time I checked the Maple
seconds.
Leafs, the last time I checked the Raptors, and the last time I checked the Blue Jays, all three are doing very well.
The last time I checked Facebook and Google, they're also doing very well. So
yeah, and and that's why we're here. We want them to share.
Thank you.
And we want them to share the money.
Kevin, can we allow Mr. Kitt to finish his answer? Mr. Kitt.
Thank you. Facebook and Google are global monopolies, and as big as Rogers and Bell are, Facebook and Google still have to pay their fair share to support Canadian media.
Thank you very much. I think that's the end of that round, and we go now to the final questioner, and that's for the Liberals, and it's Chris Biddle for 5 minutes, please, Chris.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and I'd like to start with a comment because we've been witnessing the Conservatives be cheerleaders for Facebook, be their PR team here in this committee, and all of a sudden today, there's a slight change of tone that they support journalists. Though now we hear we don't support them if they work for CTV, we don't support them if they work for City TV, we don't support, and Mr. Wa's agreeing with me, doesn't support journalists, and so I don't know if you say one thing and mean something completely different. I guess I can't say what that is because it's unparliamentary. But this is truly shocking that Conservatives continue to stand in the way, that they don't care about journalism, that they are ideologically opposed to legacy media in this country, despite the benefits, despite the importance it is to a democratic process. And we hear just a second ago all of these newsrooms closing, and there's still a suggestion that they shouldn't get any money, that they shouldn't be benefiting from this legislation. And then from another Conservative member suggesting that someone received a grant, they should be entitled to appear before this committee. Dr. Geist received a SSHRC grant years ago. Does that disentitle him? No one from this side would ever suggest that, but the Conservatives have no problem allowing witnesses who come here, one of which who lied to this committee, having received money from TikTok and Google, and that's okay because he agrees with us. And there have been witness after witness that has taken money from big tech, and there's been no issue from the Conservative Party that continues to cheerlead for big tech in this country. Some of the largest foreign companies in the world No other Conservative Party in any country that I've been looking into, be it the United States, Australia, have cheerleaded in a way that the Conservative Party of Canada has done, and it's appalling. My question is, I'll ask first question to Monsieur LaRose. Across Canada, we're seeing growing news deserts. I haven't seen any specific data on news loss in Indigenous communities, but I was wondering if you can tell us if that's the case. And
yeah, certainly. Some of the news organizations, for example. One of the organizations I represent, First Peoples Radio, we've had to lay off our reporters because of the losses of revenue from cutbacks in advertising and other forms of support, which were minimal. So we now have no more reporters on staff. And there are other smaller publications that have tried to launch and haven't been able to maintain the course. So I don't have exact numbers because we really aren't structured in a way through an organization that would allow us to have such data handy, which is unfortunate because it would make for a stronger case here. But there have been other smaller newspapers, Indigenous newspapers out west that have had to close because the advertising revenue had totally dried up, and federal advertising that they used to count on to survive dried up as well.
thank you so much. I'd like to ask a question to Dr. Owen. Is it fair to say that currently platforms are choosing winners and losers, especially as they set the term of licensing agreements?
I mean, they're in negotiation of the terms of those agreements with the publishers that they have entered into agreements with. So I don't think they're necessarily setting those terms, but they're certainly choosing the organizations with which they enter into those agreements. Yes.
Can you speak how C18 fundamentally changes this power and balance and by leaving the determination of fair value to the negotiation?
Well, for one, it does do that. It provides a regulatory oversight to that process itself. But also it allows any eligible news organization to benefit from the similar kind of deals as their competitors, which in my view makes the journalism market more equitable while still providing that area, that line of funding for journalism organizations from platforms. So to me, you continue to get the flow of funds, and they get distributed more equitably across journalism organizations who are competing against each other. We should want that market to be
30
fair.
seconds.
So much, Madam Chair.
30 seconds.
Yeah, I don't think I can get another question.
Well,
just to use my last few seconds to say, I hope that we really have turned a corner in this debate. We've heard a change of tone from the Conservatives, and I hope that continues on. I hope there's some real action on helping journalists, because that has been completely absent except for a few words today. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Biddle. Now, this is the end of our round. It's going to be the end of the meeting, and I want to thank the witnesses for coming and answering some pretty hard questions. And I'm sorry if I pushed you to be concise, but we wanted to get as many questions and answers in as possible to inform this committee. So I want to thank you all very, very much, and for attending and for actually taking, as I said, some pretty difficult questions. So with that, before I adjourn, I just wanted to remind the committee that the deadline, as unanimously approved by this committee, the deadline for amendments for Bill C-18 is at 5 p.m. on Thursday, November the 10th. Just a reminder. And that we will move to clause by clause on Friday, November the 18th. So thank you all very much. I move that this meeting be adjourned. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you.